Thank you, Leanna Schooley and TCU, Library Center for Texas Studies. I'm really thrilled to be here at TCU. Even though it's an overcast day, it's a good day to talk about what happened in 1997 in Fort Davis, Texas, West Texas. And I want to tell you that the way that I started writing this book was because I was at a book signing for my first book, The Broken Spoke, Austin's Legendary Honky Tonk, and a woman came up to me and she said, I know what your next book's going to be. And she handed me a stack of papers. And her father was Peyton McKnight, who's in my Broken Spoke book, as a very flamboyant senator. And Molly McKnight said that she thought that this would make a good story. So I started interviewing Molly and her good friend Joanne Turner once a week in my home for 2.5 years. And I soon found out that this was a story beyond Joanne Turner, but it enveloped the entire community of Fort Davis. So I began searching for the Texas Rangers. I searched for the residents. I searched for all of the people who prosecuted, the judges, and I even flew to Amarillo and interviewed Richard Lance McLaren, where he's serving 99 years in prison. So all of the principal people involved were interviewed and told their story without any editing or interference from me. Being an old school journalist, I feel like being objective is very important. And one of the people that I interviewed was the FBI consultant of the Standoff, Gary Nussner. He was also present at the Waco Standoff 4 years earlier. And he had such insight for the Texas Rangers. He said, let's not make the same mistakes that were made at Waco. And we're going to let the local law enforcement handle this. And that's why it was such a successful standoff. I don't know how many of you remember that standoff, but it was successful because the Texas Rangers were so good at handling this in a calm, very focused, logical way. Gary Nussner also had a directive from the U.S. Attorney General, Janet Reno, and she said, I want you to pull all of the FBI, I want you to pull all of the ATF out of Fort Davis and let the locals handle it. So Gary Nussner stayed behind on his own recognizance, just as his own voluntary self to direct the Texas Rangers. And he did a wonderful job too. Now, Joanne Turner, the way that she got involved was her house was about to be foreclosed in West Texas, in Westlake, outside of Austin. And she got a little postcard in the mail. That was one of the ways that her house was foreclosed, despite all of their sayings, their promises. She lost everything. She even lost her baby pictures. They came in semi-trucks. They took everything. The local title company, Alamo Title, Travis County, came and took everything and left her with a table, some chairs, and a bed. And she moved into the Shepherd Hill Apartments. And after she did move in, she began working for the Republic of Texas, Richard McLaren and others, typing up their documents. And one of their ways that they attacked businesses was with a lien to freeze the assets of the business. And this at the time was not illegal to file illegal or fraudulent liens against businesses. But Danny Morales, who had his own problems as the Texas Attorney General, he had Joanne arrested in Austin on April 22nd, 1997 for writing those liens. And he put her in jail for 40 days. And some would say that he put her in jail as bait for the Republic of Texas. He wanted action because an election was coming up, you see. This was before he was prosecuted for some of the things that we know him about in history and in the cigarette scandal. But at the time, everyone thought that Joanne was going to be the only person, quote, arrested in Austin for the Republic of Texas writing these liens. But it quickly changed. Richard McLaren got a phone call from Joanne, and she said, I've been arrested, and he said, this means war. They're going to come after us next. He had created his embassy, as he called it, in Fort Davis, and it was really just a mobile home with a shanty or lean-to attached. It was only about 2 or 3 rooms, but he called it his embassy up in the mountains, and he had procured 900 acres by writing liens against his neighbors because they could not find titles to the land going back 4 and 5 generations. He had gone to the Jeff Davis County Courthouse and discovered that 4 and 5 generations of these Texans had occupied land in the Davis Mountains without clear titles, because the history says that Stephen F. Austin and other settlers came to that region at the invitation of the Mexican government who owned that land at the time when it was called Tejas, and they became Texians, and they were paid money to occupy the land, and they built their homes and thousands of acres. And so Richard McLaren decided that since they didn't hold actual legal titles, that he could, under Texas adverse possession laws, occupy the land, make improvements, and it would be his. So he got 900 acres that way. And he put in a vineyard, and he built his embassy on the land. And then he realized he didn't have water, so then he also went ahead and wrote liens against his neighboring members of the community to get a well so that he could have water to his embassy. And people in the area were divided. Some people liked Richard McLaren and some people didn't, but almost everybody realized that he was kind of in for personal gain. He and his members of the Republic of Texas militia, thank you, felt that they were going to eventually take over so much land that they would, in fact, own Texas. This book is published by Texas A&M Press, and I broke it into 3 parts. Before the war, which really focuses on Joanne and how the Republic of Texas was set up. Then during the war, which was a 5-day to 7-day standoff, and then after the war. And then Joanne Turner, who was their secretary, is the thread that goes through the whole book. And this is a picture I took of her in my home before she passed. And she was the catalyst because she called Richard McLaren. And this is a picture I took of Richard in prison in 2018. And at the time, he still believed he was the rightful leader of the Republic of Texas and owned Texas, the nation. He had been in isolation for more than 20 years, only allowed out in the yard by himself once a day, and he still had the same idea that he was writing a great lien against the state of Texas that he believed had been annexed illegally by the United States in 1845. It didn't have a quorum to make, he said. However, he forgot to mention that Texas joined the Confederacy in the Civil War. So when the North won, all bets were off. In Texas versus White, the Supreme Court ruled that it's illegal to secede from the Union. It's treason. He's in William P. Clements Unit Prison. And I'm going to go back. This is kind of what the territory of the Republic of Texas looked like in 1845. As you can see, it stretched up into Colorado, and it took in part of, it looks like Kansas. When Richard McLaren decided that he was going to declare war, and he did go on what then was dial-up internet. They had internet there in Fort Davis that was just very slow and pioneering for compared to today's internet. But his few internet connections, and then he also had a ham radio. He also used the local radio station. He used the local newspaper, the Dispatch in Jeff Davis, to alert people that he felt were going to feel sympathetic to his cause. And he said, I'm going to war against the United States, and I'm going to reclaim Texas. There was a sheriff in Jeff Davis County at the time, Steve Bailey, who had heard often from a local resident, Joe Rowe, about the goings-on up at Richard McLaren's embassy. And they were building pipe bombs and putting down tripwires and filling 5 and 10-gallon tanks with gas that they were going to roll down the hill at the enemy in case there was an attack. They were modifying semi-automatic weapons to rapid fire. They would shoot 3 bullets when you pulled the trigger, which is against the National Firearms Act. So he went to Fort Stockton, and he talked to an attorney there, Albert Valdez. He talked to the captain of the Texas Rangers, Barry Caver, and he said, what can I do about this? And they said, you can't do anything until they leave the private compound where they're at. Don't try to arrest them. Don't go into their compound. Just wait till one of them comes out. So Joe Rowe called the day, 5 days after Joanne was arrested, he called Steve Bailey and he said, they're leaving, one of them's leaving the compound right now in front of my house, because Joe's house was right there at the entrance of the Davis Mountain Resort where Richard McLaren and other people lived, kind of a little subdued, off-the-grid lifestyle. And he called and he said, they're coming right now. And he's changing the license plates on his white van. Come and get him. So Steve Bailey, who was cooking breakfast for his family, put down his apron and his flipper and put on his hat and got in his truck and got out on the 166. And he arrested Robert Scheit. Now, the DMR amounts to just 50 miles of dirt roads, and a lot of the people that live there really don't want to be bothered. Some of them don't have running water, electricity, etc. But Joe Rowe's house was beautiful, and it stood right at the entrance. This is kind of an aerial map of his home right at the entrance to the DMR. So this is a picture of Robert Scheit after he was arrested by Steve Bailey for not only having an illegal license plate, but for having automatic weapons that have been modified in the back of his truck. And whenever this happened, there was a dispatcher who was handling 3 or 4 counties at the time, all on one communication line. We had Brewster, we had Jeff Davis County, and we had Presidio County, which covered about 130,000 square miles. And so it was broadcast that Robert Scheit had been picked up. And Steve Bailey used the word, I got a man down. So all the people in Fort Davis had dispatch receivers. They could hear these communications from the dispatcher. Richard McLaren heard that and he said, oh, they've shot Robert Scheit. They've killed Robert Scheit. Get your weapons and let's go take the Joe Rowe's house at the entrance to the DMR. So Greg Paulson and his wife Karen and Richard Keyes, the 3 of them got in their cars and they drove to Joe Rowe's house, and they parked out front, and Joe opened the door just enough to allow his gun to peek through the door. And he saw Greg Paulson in the front, and he saw Karen Paulson go around to the back. And he saw Richard Keyes drive up in his little Volkswagen and peel out in the front yard in front of the entrance where the cattle guard is. And Greg Paulson said, we're going to take the place, Joe. And Joe says, yeah, but I've got my eye on you. And he was pointing his gun at Greg, and Greg was pointing his gun at him. And Greg said, and I see that. Joe's dog was on the front porch. And Joe said, don't shoot my dog. Don't shoot my dog. I'll put my gun down. So he put his gun down, and just as he did, the light from the bathroom window behind him shone through the glass door enough that made him a target. And Greg fired his gun. And the gun went through Joe Rowe's shoulder into the wall behind. It shattered the glass in the door. It shattered the glass in the bathroom, which I saw all of this. He left the bullet hole in the wall when I visited Joe Rowe. And he went down. He had been taking Coumadin for heart trouble, so he was bleeding profusely. His wife, M.A., which they called Ma Rowe, got on the dispatch phone and said, dispatcher, get my sheriff, Joe's been shot. That also went out to all the repeaters, the scanners throughout the 3 different counties. And it was kind of like the Katzenjammer Kids. Everybody's listening and thinking, okay, so now first we had Robert Scheit shot and killed, now we got Joe probably killed. And so this brought in 300 law enforcement agents all at the same time. David Duncan, who was a Texas Ranger in Presidio at the time, heard the repeater on his car. He was answering a separate call where a man had gone off the road and crashed somewhere in the night. And just a few minutes earlier, he had interrupted the channel by saying, when's the coroner going to get here? So you can imagine that Richard McLaren and his group hearing Robert Scheit's been shot, then when's the coroner going to get here? They're thinking, this is really bad. We need to get over there. So they bust through the door. They take M.A. hostage. They take Joe Rowe hostage. And they set up their front where they're going to fight the United States feds when they come. They filled the bathtubs with water. They prepared. They got the candles out. They got all the guns together. They had duffel bags full of ammunition, and they waited. The phone at the time was on a wall, it was a landline wall, and that's the one that Richard Keyes pulled out of M.A.'s hand and hung up. But then he used the phone to call some of his relatives and tell them that he was at a standoff and he was making history and that he didn't know if he was going to live or die. He hung up the phone, and no sooner had he hung it up, Barry Caver, who was the captain in Midland, got the call, and he called and he said, you need to give yourselves up. And Greg Paulson refused. He called him every name in the book and used foul language. So David Duncan had called Barry Caver, and Barry Caver, who is the commander of the Texas Rangers, less than 6 months, he said, you know what, I'm going to be the commander, but I'm going to get Jess Malone, another Texas Ranger, to be the negotiator. They wanted to exchange the Rows for Robert Scheit, who had been brought to Brewster County Jail, and then they set up their stronghold at the Friend Ranch Road there in the Davis Mountain Resort. It used to be a volunteer fire department, just a few miles down from the embassy. And they actually did the exchange. And the way that it happened was they put a bag over Robert Scheit's head so that he couldn't see how many Rangers were there at site. They let him go. They took him to his van. They took the cover off his head and let him drive up the road. He honked 3 times at the row house and said, y'all come out. So that Greg Paulson and Richard Keyes could come out. And the problem is that Richard Keyes had shot the tires out of his Volkswagen to block the road. So their getaway was no longer usable. So they said to Joe, can we borrow your truck? So they borrowed Joe's truck and drove it up to Richard McLaren's house, followed by Robert Scheit in the van, and that's when the real standoff began. The Rows are rescued, the ambulance crew arrived, and one of the requirements was that the Republic of Texas says if you come to Joe Rowe's house in an ambulance, everyone must be in their underwear so we know they're not packing any guns. So the whole crew in the ambulance was in their underwear when they picked up Joe Rowe and his wife. Joe is hospitalized. He had some bone damage. He had some bleeding, but he was well enough within 24 hours. And this is a picture of Jess, who was the negotiator. And he began talking by the radio, by the phone, and by the ham, trying to talk to the people in the embassy to figure out how many people were there, because Richard McLaren always exaggerated the number of people who were members of the Republic of Texas, and they had no idea how many people were in the embassy. It started making the front page of newspapers everywhere with a picture of Joanne Kennedy up in the corner here. And the countdown of how things progressed. At the Point of Rocks is where the media set up. And it's kind of an area, like a rest area, with some giant lava rocks that people like to climb. And it didn't have a lot of electricity to it. So a friend of mine, Carl Covington, he was an electrician. So he set up poles and electricity for CNN and NBC, ABC, NBC, and decided to stick around and watch the excitement. This is a picture of the embassy. The little mobile trailer with the shanty attached, as you can see, not even 900 square feet. And this is a picture of Gary Nussner, the negotiator, who also was at Waco, who wrote my books forward. So day 2, these people are holed up in the embassy. They're still claiming that they are going to take back Texas. And there's this man named Robert White Eagle Otto. And he was a newcomer to the Republic of Texas militia, but he was kind of in charge of the gasoline tanks and the tripwires. Well, on day 3, Jess Malone got tired of being called every name in the book when he talked to these people on the phone. So he said, I'm going to call in some people out at the military base outside Fort Stockton, and they're going to bring an M88. And an M88 is bigger than a regular tank. It flattened 15 cars around the embassy within just minutes. And Jess Malone says in the book that it sounded like everybody in that building was in puberty and screaming at the top of their lungs, he's going to kill us all. And Jess said, now that I have your attention, please stop using foul language when we speak on the phone, and let's have civil conversations. And about that time, Richard McLaren was calling in all his friends from around Texas on his ham radio. And he said, we're at war, we need backup. Come out quick, they're going to kill us. And there were some Texas Rangers who just happened to be having lunch at a truck stop in Pecos. And they heard this on the radio. And they had an idea that whoever was coming to Fort Davis was going to stop there for lunch or was going to drive through that area. And sure enough, they pulled over a car. Captain Carl Weathers pulled over a car with 7 men in a 1983 Oldsmobile, and it was loaded with weapons. Sympathizers. About that time, Richard McLaren decided he needed an attorney to liaison between him and the government. He hired Terrence O'Rourke, who is the uncle of Beto O'Rourke, and Terrence O'Rourke decided the weakest link in this group is Evelyn McLaren, the common law wife of Richard McLaren. And he said, I know she has family, so he contacted the family and said, please write a letter to your mother. And this is the letter that they wrote. And he read it aloud at the media so that everyone would hear that the daughters and their grandson wanted Evelyn to surrender. We know when we talked to you on the phone Sunday that you weren't watching the news, and it's clear that you're not home baking cookies. You joked with me and said, no, I'm cooking chicken. And you said you weren't anywhere near what was going on, not to worry. I would certainly rather have y'all in prison than in the line of fire. This is no joke. But that didn't stir Evelyn enough to surrender. So then They sent in snipers behind the 6,000-foot ridge behind the embassy. And while the snipers were up there with their guns aimed at the people at the embassy, Richard McLaren and his group came out and cooked steaks. And they waved to the snipers. And they said, you know, it's such a nice day, we want to hang out outside. Just sort of teasing them to take action, but they didn't. They had great restraint. Then, one day, Robert Scheidt just started walking out of the embassy, and he walked down the road to where the Rangers were, the Texas Rangers. And he said, I've had enough of this. I want to give myself up. Those people are a bunch of nuts. And then, at that time, Jess Malone convinced Evelyn, because she had talked to her daughters on the phone, because they flew by helicopter to the Point of Rocks with their grandson, and they talked to her, and they said, please, Mom, give yourself up. So Jess Malone talked to Evelyn and said, we would love for you to come out and surrender peacefully and end the standoff. And that was 8 o'clock in the morning, and she said, okay, but I have to do my hair and put on my makeup first. At 10 o'clock at night, she finally came out and gave herself up. And she talked on the phone to her husband. They had a code that they shared, and she said, I'm safe and I'm being treated respectfully, so you can come out. And Richard McLaren came out. And Greg and Karen went to sit by the flagpole and gave themselves up in military fashion. But you know what? The first thing Richard McLaren wanted to do when he came out and they handcuffed him, he wanted to shake hands with Barry Caver, the captain. He was just so impressed with how Barry Caver handled the standoff peacefully. And then White Eagle Otto also gave himself up. But there were two people left in the embassy who weren't willing to give themselves up. Richard Keyes, the 19-year-old, and Mike Matson. And they decided to escape into the hills. And the hills of Fort Davis are very rocky and filled with all kinds of creote and mesquite and bushes and thorns, and also rattlesnakes and bobcats. It's very treacherous. Even horses have trouble getting through that brush. So they brought in some dogs from the James Linnau unit prison in Fort Stockton. And these dogs were just tracking dogs. They were not vicious. As you can see, they look like little combo hound beagles, very sweet. The lead dog's name was Sugar. That gives you an idea. And so they brought in Sugar as the lead dog and all these other 40 dogs, and they tracked through the mountains. They tracked down Mike Matson, and he fired on them and killed Sugar at point blank. She just sat there like, I found you, and he shot her. The helicopters from above saw the whole scene with the Texas Rangers inside. Then he started firing at the helicopter. So they had no choice but to fire back. But there was one man named Eric Petkachek, and he fired with his dad's Winchester rifle. He was the leader of the dogs, and he shot Mike Matson in one shoulder. He spun around and shot him in the chest, and he died instantly. And when he died, the Rangers said, you know what? We're going to take Sugar out first and bring her back to the Linnau unit, and then we'll get Matson out. So that's what they did. They continued their search with the horses and the dogs in the mountains for the rest of the day. As the twilight came, they said, you know, this is dangerous, and he's probably found a ride somewhere, and he's probably gone. We're going to have to try a different means to find him. We got to go back to the embassy and undo the tripwires, the pipe bombs, and get the gasoline tanks out of there. Because just like now, it was very dry, even though it had had a light snowfall the day before. They were worried those tanks, if they rolled down the hill, the whole mountainside would catch on fire and kill people in their homes. So the EOD squad came in. They found 12 gasoline containers. Can you imagine? Rigged with fuel, ready to be ignited, rolled downhill. 20 and 30 and 40 pipe bombs, tripwires and booby traps, guns that had been modified, even a cannon. This is the living room of the embassy. As you can see, just absolutely a mess when they entered. This is the kitchen view. They used propane to light the stove, and how Evelyn was able to exist in that environment. Another view of the table where they ate. And this is their library, and every kind of book, anti-government book published that you can find was there. How to build bombs out of just junk, and arsenal, and you name it. Heavy firepower, turning junk into arsenal and weaponry. They even created an arm patch that had the official Star of Texas that said Republic of Texas Defense Forces that they wore, the militia emblem. They had a magazine that came out once a month that they distributed to members. This is one of the covers of the magazine. And most startling of all was they were using the official Texas seal, and they put it on their checks for the Republics of Texas, and they were cashing them in a bank in Puerto Rico. Millions of dollars. They bought a jet, they bought jewels, they bought furs. Who needs furs in West Texas, really? And that's a picture of Eric Pekacek, who was the field lieutenant who shot Mike Madsen. And so they decided the search had to end in the DMR, and the FBI was now going to search for some places where the family of Mike Madsen lived in Houston. Here's some of the Rangers that were involved in Company E. And it was many months later, in September 20th, from May to September, they searched. And the father of Richard Keyes tipped them off that he was receiving mail. And so they went to Houston. There's a national park there. And he had a tent, and he was kind of living in survivalist mode. And when the FBI and DPS surrounded him, he gave himself up peacefully. Then there was a state trial, and it was moved on a change of venue because so many people in Fort Davis knew about it. They moved it to the Alpine Courthouse. And Judge DeHart sentenced McLaren to 99 years and a $10,000 fine for plotting a kidnapping. That was soon appealed in El Paso and rescinded, but in the meantime, the government kept Richard McLaren in jail because they knew he was going to be tried for bank fraud and mail fraud, for writing checks with the Texas seal, in using the Texas coffers, and using the U.S. mail to send this stuff. And another ruling decided that they would change the wording to organized crime, and that stuck. So he was tried and convicted for organized crime in the state of Texas. Meanwhile, Greg and Karen Paulson were tried separately in Marfa in 1998. And Karen Paulson was not a Native American, not a native citizen of the United States. She was from Germany. So she received a 30-year sentence for burglary, but her sentence was commuted to her home country of Germany. We don't know whether she ever served. She left the country. Richard Keyes is still in jail, serving his 90-year sentence, and apparently not doing very well. He was very young at the time, had some mental health issues, and isolation has not served that very well. Another 6-week-long trial in Dallas with Joe Fish officiating. I talked to the prosecutors, Mike Ewell and Paul Coggins, and they said they had disrupted the trial so many times, just like in Brewster County. They had to remove Richard McLaren from the courtroom, because he refused to have anybody act as his attorney. He wanted to talk in his own defense. Even though Tom Mills represented McLaren, McLaren kept interrupting proceedings with rants and yelling, so he had to watch his trial in a little enclosed room on a closed room television set. Then there was the federal indictments. And this is where it really got interesting, because their reach had gone way beyond Texas and had incorporated so many people outside of Texas that they were writing checks for millions of dollars to banks all over the country and cashing it and buying jewelry and silver stars that said the Republic of Texas Militia. So the federal indictments for mail and bank fraud followed. Then there were some new members that joined up with them, 6 new members that didn't even live in Texas. And also they had filed liens against the Texas governor at the time, George W. Bush. And they told him to vacate his office. The trial went on and they convicted all ROT members of overall conspiracy. Richard McLaren was sentenced to 21 counts and fined $24 million plus. He never paid it, and he never got to serve his federal conviction, because he's still serving his state conviction. Evelyn served 12 years, and she currently lives in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and she cleans houses for a living. These are some of the names of the people who were also convicted that weren't from West Texas, that got involved in the bank fraud and were using some of the money from the checks that were used to add to the coffers of the Republic of Texas Militia. Lynn Knock, Richard George Kinninger, who, by the way, Kinninger is mentioned in documents at other standoffs in history. Joe Lewis, Jasper Edward Bacchus, Irwin Leo Brown, and Stephen Craig Greer. Richard Rance McLaren and prosecutors appealed, not prosecutors, attorneys appealed with Judge Paul Friedman, but he affirmed the state's original sentencing, as did Susan Larson in El Paso. And then on August 26, 2001, Gerald Caruth served as the prosecutor in the final federal trial, and this was violating the National Firearms Act. For 3 days, they pleaded guilty, all of them this time, for modifying their weapons and destructive devices in the Davis Mountain Resort. And I have some pictures of, in my book, I have over 50 pictures, and some of them are the family of Joanne Turner, so you can get an idea that she was married to Bill Turner. He was a band leader in Austin for a long time. She worked as a real estate agent and networker. They had a son, Jeff, who went to Lanier High School. He escaped to South America. We don't really know where he is now. He's got domestic violence charges against him in a separate incident. Their daughter, Kellyanne Turner, went to Hill Country Middle School. She graduated Westlake High School, the most premier, most wealthy district in Austin, graduated University of Texas. She went to work for Southwest Airlines, but she was murdered by her boyfriend. In November 1st, yesterday, was the anniversary, 2014, and her boyfriend from Oakland, California, was sentenced and is serving time in Beeville for that murder. Richard Rance McLaren, we don't know a whole lot about, except what his cousin told me, Chuck Sampson. He said he was a fast talker. He always had an opinion that he wanted to share. He learned a lot about Texas while he was living in Missouri. He read about the Texas history and was fascinated with the heroes of the Alamo, who also were not native Texans. So he felt himself kind of a non-native son who was going to liberate Texas from a false government. That's what he told me. Just like Bowie and Crockett. He lived in his first few years with his grandparents in a very regal home with his mother, because his father abandoned the family when he was less than a year old. Mary June Sampson served as a library at Texas A&M University for 20 years. This is a picture of all of them at the table with his cousin Chuck and his father on the right, and his grandfather, Chuck Sr., at the head of the table. Picture with, not very happy picture of Chuck Sr. with Richard McLaren's father, Mac McLaren. Another family picture with June holding Richard as a baby. And these are some of the things that people said about my book. I like to think that I let the people who were there, the primary sources, tell the story in their own words. I didn't editorialize or use any of my own opinion. And a lot of people forgot about this standoff. And now when they read it, they go, wait a minute, I remember something like that. I love this quote by Mike Cox, who was there. He was the DPS chief who kind of did all the public service announcements during the standoff. He said, Donna Marie has done such a fine job telling the story of the 1997 Republic of Texas standoff at Fort Davis. Not only did I enjoy reading this book, I learned much about the incident that I didn't know, which, considering that I was there as the chief spokesman for the Texas Department of Public Safety when many of the events in this book went down. And then Chris Tomlinson, who co-wrote the book Forget the Alamo, also wrote wonderful notes about how valid this story is today. She delivers a thorough reporting, new sources, and telling details about how a financial crisis drove a middle-class Texan to join a nationalist militia and become the center of an armed standoff with Texas Rangers. Texas secessionists, well-meaning people, into challenging the fundamental principles of society and ruining lives in the process. The 1997 Republic of Texas War may have ended 26 years ago now, but the lessons in Miller's book are more relevant than ever. I was proud that last year, for the bicentennial of the Texas Rangers, they made my book part of their permanent catalog, and it bears the seal. I want to thank Joanne Turner, the late Joanne Turner, my friend, who helped me tell this story in this book, and Texas Rangers, and Joe Rowe. What a wonderful man. He still lives in Fort Davis in his house alone. Robert Hurst, who got me in to see Richard McLaren in the prison where he's being held. And it wasn't like Silence of the Lambs, okay? There was a plexiglass between us. He had a mic. He was on the other side with an armed guard. And we spoke, and I recorded the interview and then sent him a transcript, as I did everyone. I'm an old school journalist, and I believe in that. Record, transcribe, and then let the person see what you're going to write about them before you put it in the book. And I want to thank the FBI agent Gary Nussner, former, the Texas A&M University Press, Tom Lemons, who was my chief editor, and Chuck Sampson for sharing all his family photos. You can find my book wherever books are sold. Book People, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, and even Texas A&M Press. And I'll take questions. Thank you very much. So, questions? Yes, sir.
Do you see any effort to get this activity resurrected based on the outcome of the election?
I have to say that if you watch Dr. Phil, you can go on YouTube, by the way, it's on YouTube. Last month, Dr. Phil interviewed the current representative from the Republic of Texas, Daniel Miller, who wrote the book Texit, Why Texas Should Secede. And the headline for Dr. Phil's program was, Are We on the Verge of Civil War? The Republic of Texas still operates out of 3 places: Kerrville, Bulverde, and also right here, right in Fort Davis. And I have no idea what the numbers are, but if you look at their website, go to the Republic of Texas militia website, they have lots of anti-government propaganda and claim that Republic of Texas is not dead, but in fact vibrant. It is a cautionary tale of what can happen and what did happen to Joanne Turner as a result of hitching her wagon to a bunch of people who claimed they could solve all her problems. They didn't solve her problems, they magnified them and made them worse. In my epilogue in my book, she says, if only I had paid my taxes, if only I had paid my mortgage, if only, if only, if only. I didn't know at the time. You know, she drank quite a bit, and she had a very terrible childhood and a terrible marriage filled with abuse, and that led to a lot of her undoing as well. Anybody else have a question? My book, by the way, is being made into a movie. I've written the pilot with the producer, and we are working on the subsequent episode. It'll be a biopic, not a documentary. Kind of like Waco, if you watch that on Amazon, about the Waco standoff. Did you have a question?
Did they have any direct connections or learn anything from the Branch Davidians?
Well, the question is, did they learn anything from the Branch Davidians? The episode, the event in which the Branch Davidians were sieged by the United States government in 1993 had a huge impact. The FBI agent who was the negotiator at that standoff, Gary Nussner, is the man that I interviewed for my book, who was president Republic of Texas standoff in Fort Davis, and he wrote my book's foreword, and he said, don't do what the ATF did. Don't do what the government did and escalate this to a war and let people's lives be lost. And they operated under such restraint. I'm so proud of the Texas Rangers and the local and law enforcement, because only one person died, and that's because he killed the dog and he fired on the Rangers in the helicopter. So yes, that hangs in everybody's memory because 51 lives were lost as opposed to one life. It's sad that we only remember tragic history and we forget the success stories in history like this one was. But this is not the end all. We are on the precipice of many, many people uprising again in a way maybe not unlike what happened in 1997. Anybody else have a question? Yes.
As part of the process, did you also interview people who were just local townsfolk about what they thought at the time and then maybe thought today in hindsight?
I did. My friend Carl Covington, who knew Richard McLaren when he worked in a kitchen, and Carl would go and work on the stoves and the electricity in the Blue Moon restaurant. And also Mr. Dillard, who was the editor of the paper, Jeff Davis Dispatch, who's now deceased. He knew Richard and published a lot of his epitaphs in the newspaper, his documents about why Texas should secede. And a lot of the EMS volunteers and fire department volunteers that lived in Fort Davis, Mr. Rea and his wife Karen, there were so many in the book that just wanted to express their side of the story. And I tried in a respectful way to cover every single facet of everyone's story in a respectful manner without opinion of my own. Anybody else have a question? One of the neat things about, I call it farming people's stories. You are given so many opportunities to hear other people's stories, whether you're in the checkout line at the grocery store, the post office, work, on an airplane, going somewhere. Somebody always has a story. And these stories, not all of them end up in print, but I'm always honored that they shared them with me. A lot of my stories as a reporter began with just a conversation and turned into something that people could enjoy for years to come. So,
Well,
thank you so much.
for
Thank
being
you.
here with us
Thank you.
today.